This is an exclusively breastfeeding mom. She says, pediatrician says my baby is eating too much. Everything I have read encourages to breastfeed on the baby's schedule. Sometimes she can eat up to 6 ounces. She's just shy of 8 weeks and she weighs 10.8 pounds, that is. She told me to only feed her 4 ounces every 2 hours. I can only monitor that if I pump and make a bottle. I love nursing and don't want to just do bottles. Has anyone else heard to get them on a feeding schedule this young? Thanks. Now, the funny thing about this one is that often pediatricians and doctors are held up as the gospel truth. Their advice comes from the word of God and we should all follow it. I believe that this is pretty common in the mum sphere anyway, but maybe again, I'm being a little bit harsh here. In general, I'm not even saying, I'm not knocking doctors as a whole. But what I do think very often happens, especially with pediatricians or with other doctors who do the same types of procedures over and over and over again, is they kind of get into this, in my opinion, autopilot mode, where they're so used to doing and saying a certain thing that they don't really engage or interact with you as a human being, as an individual who has their own medical history, who has their own circumstances, who has their own opinions and thoughts and so on. And what that feels like when you're on the receiving end of it is that you're kind of like a little cog in the wheel and they're just getting you through the routine stuff. They're telling you the routine stuff. And maybe they give you advice that they believe is applicable to 90% of babies or to 90% of mothers or whatever it is. But that advice is not actually tailored to your situation. That's my biggest problem with doctors across the board. And it happens especially often with pediatricians because quite a lot of what they do, at least where I live, is pretty regimented. They always have the same set of tests that they go through with a baby and so on. And then the same bits of advice that they give. And obviously most new parents have the same kinds of questions. And that's kind of the outcome. Now, I honestly don't believe that we have ever at any point in our history, barring the last, let's say 50, 60 years, considered the actual exact amounts that babies are drinking. And so this is one of those bits of advice where I'm a bit like, especially when it comes to breastfeeding, I understand that with formula, there's a lot more variation. And I even understand if you're bottle feeding all the time, because there as well, maybe it's a little bit harder for babies to regulate the amount that they want to drink, just because a bottle usually has a bit of a faster flow. But fundamentally, I would always be like, okay, so we haven't really been able to know exactly how much babies are drinking and how much variation there is in that ever in our history, except for the last few decades. Can a doctor really give amazing advice when it comes to that? Especially if a doctor is saying, feed her less than she seems to want. That seems very dodgy. If a doctor is saying, you probably need to feed her more because she's not gaining weight, then fair enough. That makes perfect sense. And you can observe her weight gain and see that there's an actual consequence to the amount of food that she's eating. But feeding her less sounds to me like a huge risk would be having a starving baby who's super hungry and is not being fed just because someone is following a doctor's instructions. And so honestly, sometimes I believe that doctors, despite the fact that they're in this amazing position of they have a huge responsibility and they kind of have a lot of power when it comes to giving advice and providing recommendations for mothers, sometimes I really feel like that responsibility is not taken quite as seriously as it should be, and advice is given too lightly and too quickly. Now, obviously, I'm talking here from my personal experience. If anyone's like, hey, you know what, my doctor's amazing and she always treats us the best and she always looks after us and knows exactly what our baby needs and so on, then I'm super happy for you. That's awesome. Having a great doctor makes a huge difference. But what I always feel for everyone is that you should, again, have a little bit of critical thought. It's important to actually consider the advice that your doctor is giving you and to try and find out. One of the hilarious situations that we had with our pediatrician, we tried to ask him about why he was doing some of the procedures that are like some of the regular tests that they do with babies here. And one of them is this ultrasound where they check the hip joint to see that the hip joint is growing properly. And we asked him exactly how often do babies have problems with this. And he was like, he sat there and he thought about it for a little bit and he went, something like 5%. So he claimed that 5% of all babies suffer from a hip malformation when they are born. And then, of course, we looked this up when we got home, and the actual number was something like 0.003%, which is a huge, huge, huge difference. So huge that it actually boggles my mind that he was that far off, because it would have meant that, 5% would say that that 5 out of every 100 babies, or 1 out of every 20 babies that he sees, are suffering from this, so he should have experienced it, or should have known it. And so in general, that's how I feel about this one. I would not be trying to get my baby on a feeding schedule, and I would have asked my doctor why she thinks I should restrict the amount that my baby wants to nurse, if she wants to nurse naturally. And pretty much everyone in the comment, which is actually quite surprising, pretty much everyone in the thread also says the same. So here's an example. She says, "That's so weird. I've never heard of this. I personally wouldn't listen. Everyone's breast milk is different. Some have plenty of calories or whatever per ounce and only need 4, and others need 8. Did the pediatrician say why? I would listen to what your gut is telling you." And then OP says, I told her that sometimes when she eats out of the bottles, she'll eat, say, 4 ounces, and then 20 minutes later, she'll eat another 2-ounce bottle. She didn't give me a reason. She was just like, don't do that. She asked me if she was spitting up, and she hasn't been, so I don't know. I think I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. Then she said, don't worry about her routine until 4 months. So maybe she was just having an off day. And you can see this is often what really happens to people. They get this kind of advice where they're like, I don't really understand why I should be doing that. And then for whatever reason, in the appointment, it doesn't actually come up, and then they go home, and that's when they think about it, and then they're like, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Now, if she was a little bit less critical, she would go, okay, I'll just do that, and then she'll go ahead and do it, and then she might have a baby that's suffering and hungry for absolutely no reason, based on advice that she doesn't understand and she doesn't know why she should follow. So that's why I think that this is a problem. Another one here, she says, if you're feeding from the breast, I wouldn't worry about the baby getting too much. The baby will know how much she needs. You could potentially overfeed with a bottle if you feed too fast, but it sounds like you're doing fine. So, doctors. This one says 10.8 pounds. My baby weighed that at a month, and the doctor said that was great. Keep up the good work. I would personally ignore the doctor. It's hard enough without doctors saying stuff like that. Doctors are generally great, but they can be wrong, and I definitely think in this case they're wrong. From everything I've been told and researched, you can't overfeed a breastfed baby. And so this is just to illustrate that sometimes doctors give advice just a little bit too lightly, and I think that as a parent you always have the responsibility to not follow advice without thinking it through. I'm not saying don't consider your doctor's advice. You should always consider your doctor's advice, and you can always listen to them. But at the very least, you should be able to sit down with them and ask them why they think certain things. And then you just have the responsibility of understanding why it is they're recommending something, and what's the danger or the risk that you might be facing if you don't follow that.